Eddie Torres had always thought he'd found his peaceful paradise on Eden 5. After decades of chaos in space as an ex-Marine, life on his sprawling ranch with Big Thunder, his genetically exceptional bull, was a dream come true. Big Thunder was no ordinary animal. He was the epitome of selective breeding, a beast that commanded respect in the Galactic Livestock Expo. Eddie poured his heart and soul into his ranch, and the bond he shared with his bull was as deep as family. The idyllic life Eddie had built was about to shatter, and it all began with an absurd incident, a fence breaking. Big Thunder, as powerful as he was, didn't realize the fence was a boundary, and as bulls sometimes do, he ventured into Karen Whitlock's pristinely manicured garden. The garden was no mere patch of green, but a meticulous showcase of exotic flowers, carefully tended to by Karen herself, a woman who had too much time on her hands and far too much power as the HOA president. When Eddie was told of the incident, it didn't sound like a big deal. A few flowers trampled by a bull, nothing too tragic. He assumed Karen would be upset, maybe even ask him to fix it, but he never expected the storm that followed. Karen Whitlock was notorious among the residents of the neighborhood. Her role as HOA president wasn't one she took lightly. With a scowl permanently etched on her face and a list of regulations for everything from the size of your lawnmower to how many plants you could have in your garden, she was a woman who thrived on control. Everyone in the community knew to tread lightly around Karen, but Eddie had always found her petty demands laughable. He didn't understand the obsession with keeping everything perfect when life was too short, especially on a new world like Eden 5. The landscape was untamed, the potential for exploration limitless. Yet Karen found satisfaction in reigning over the smallest details. When Eddie arrived home, he was greeted by an irate message from Karen. Apparently, Big Thunder had not only damaged her garden but, in her eyes, violated HOA rules about dangerous animals, causing property damage. Eddie's first thought was to laugh it off. This couldn't be serious. Karen's garden was hardly worth the trouble. He made his way to her house, intending to smooth things over, maybe offer to pay for the damages. That was when Karen, with her usual venom, hit him with the unexpected. She had taken matters into her own hands. Karen, in her usual misguided righteousness, had taken her personal grievance a step too far. She shot Big Thunder. No warning, no phone call, no chance for discussion. She simply shot him. The news hit Eddie like a freight train. Big Thunder, his prize bull, dead at the hands of someone who thought she was above the law. The pain was immediate, but his anger surged through him faster than he could process the loss. How could anyone be so callous, so reckless? Eddie knew Karen had crossed the line, but he didn't realize just how deep that line ran until he heard the full story from the other residents. Karen claimed she was within her rights to shoot Big Thunder, citing an obscure HOA clause about dangerous animals causing damage. But Eddie knew something didn't add up. This wasn't just about a broken fence or a few trampled flowers. This was about power. The more Eddie thought about it, the more he realized that Karen had a history of pushing people around. She'd manipulated the rules before, bending every regulation to suit her own petty whims. She had used her position as HOA president to control every aspect of the neighborhood, intimidating anyone who dared to challenge her. And now, she had killed Big Thunder without so much as a second thought. Eddie's mind raced with possibilities. Could he just let it slide? Could he walk away, accept that Big Thunder was gone and take the loss in stride? No, Eddie wasn't that kind of man. This wasn't just about his bull. It was about standing up to an unjust system, about pushing back against a woman who thought she could control everything, including his life. Eddie spent the next few hours in a fog of anger and disbelief. As night settled over the ranch, the cool air did little to calm his thoughts. He paced back and forth, trying to make sense of it all, his mind spiraling through the legal avenues he might take. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized something was terribly wrong. The HOA clause Karen had cited wasn't meant for livestock. It was a law meant for genetically engineered beasts, dangerous, uncontrollable creatures bred for warfare or mass destruction. Big Thunder was none of those things. He was a bull, bred for show and for the love of the land. This wasn't a case of dangerous property damage, it was a case of murder, plain and simple. But could he prove it? Eddie didn't have much in the way of legal expertise, but he wasn't stupid. He knew he needed help. His first instinct was to contact his old friend, Jiachin, a lawyer who had once helped him navigate a sticky situation during his time in the military. Jia was no stranger to fighting the system, and she hated the HOA with a passion. After a few quick calls, Eddie managed to get her on his side, and they began looking into the laws. The more they dug, the more they realized that Karen had taken liberties with the law, using a regulation designed for bioengineered creatures to justify shooting an innocent animal. As Eddie sat down with Jia and began to piece together the legalities, he realized that this wasn't just about getting revenge for Big Thunder. It was about standing up for every resident of Eden 5. If Karen could get away with this, who was next? The HOA, unchecked, would grow more powerful, more invasive. But this wasn't the future Eddie wanted. And he wasn't going to back down. The fight for justice was just beginning. Eddie couldn't believe what he was hearing when Jiachin started digging through the HOA bylaws. The clause Karen had cited was meant for dangerous, genetically modified creatures. Big Thunder wasn't some monster bred for war. He was a bull, raised for his genetics and reputation in the farming community. The law Karen cited had nothing to do with animals like him. But Eddie needed more than just the knowledge that she was wrong. He needed hard evidence. Something concrete that could overturn her actions and make her pay for what she had done. With Gia's help, Eddie started meticulously combing through all the HOA's legal documentation. He pored over the archives, looking for loopholes, inconsistencies, anything that could challenge Karen's authority. The first few hours were disorienting. The bylaws were dense, full of legal jargon that Eddie could barely understand. He'd never been much of a bookworm, but his military training had taught him to focus when things got rough. And this was rough. The more they read, the more obvious it became. Karen had overstepped, and she knew it. There was no legal justification for what she'd done. But getting that truth into the hands of the right people was going to take more than just finding it in the fine print. Jia was already a step ahead, making connections with other lawyers who specialized in HOA disputes. As the hours ticked by, Eddie felt the anger start to rise again. He couldn't just sit around and wait for paperwork to solve everything. He wanted action, and he wanted it now. The more he thought about it, the more the situation felt like a personal vendetta. Karen wasn't just a bureaucrat. She was a bully, someone who used the power of her position to grind down anyone she didn't like. Eddie had already been a target of her petty demands in the past. This time, though, she'd taken it too far. She'd killed his bull, his prized animal, and he couldn't let that go. The problem was, it wasn't going to be easy. Even if they could prove that Karen had misused the law, she'd fight back, and she had resources at her disposal. She wasn't just a homeowner, she controlled the HOA. That meant influence, connections, and a slew of legal loopholes she could exploit to her advantage. Eddie and Jiao were up against an entrenched system, and if they wanted to win, they'd have to outsmart it. Eddie spent the next couple of days rallying support from the community. He went door to door, talking to anyone who would listen. At first, most of the residents were hesitant, unsure of what to do. The HOA had instilled a certain level of fear in the community. Everyone was terrified of Karen, her constant reminders of rules, regulations, and the threat of fines. But slowly, as Eddie started to share his findings, people began to come around. They weren't just afraid of her, they were angry, too. They had lived in constant fear of the HOA's overreach for too long, and Eddie's case was the perfect opportunity to push back. It wasn't just the people who lived near Karen that were affected. Eddie found that she had manipulated the bylaws time and time again, using her position to fine residents for insignificant infractions, picking fights over the tiniest details. Karen's control over the HOA had turned it into a tool for personal gain, and now, with Big Thunder's death, she had gone too far. The more Eddie talked, the more people came forward with stories of her petty tyranny. Residents who had been too afraid to speak out before were now offering support. Some gave him copies of old communications they had with Karen, others provided documentation showing how she'd abused her power. By the end of the week, Eddie had built a small coalition of residents who were willing to back his cause. They were no longer just helping him for the sake of one bull. They were fighting for the future of their homes, for the integrity of the community that Karen had been slowly destroying. Eddie had what he needed: witnesses, documents, and the undeniable truth that Karen had gone rogue, using her position to manipulate the rules for personal revenge. But there was still one major hurdle left: how to present the evidence in a way that would force Karen to back down. Jia had already reached out to a few contacts within the legal community, and together, they crafted a plan. Eddie's case would be about more than just the wrongful death of Big Thunder. It would be a fight against the HOA itself, a legal battle that could force Karen out of power and bring accountability to the community. The case was solid, but Eddie knew that wasn't enough. He had to make sure the court saw it for what it was: an abuse of power, a violation of trust, and a blatant disregard for the law. The weeks leading up to the hearing were filled with strategy meetings and more evidence gathering. Eddie was relentless. He wasn't just preparing for a court case, he was preparing for war. He knew Karen would come prepared to fight back, to twist the facts and manipulate the narrative. It wasn't enough to simply present the law and the facts. They had to show the pattern of behavior, the years of abuse, and how Karen had used her position to terrorize the community. Every witness had a story. Every document painted a picture of a woman who had crossed the line time and time again. Jia was instrumental in keeping Eddie focused. She'd been through enough legal battles to know what to expect. She kept him grounded when the pressure mounted, making sure that each piece of the case was as airtight as possible. Eddie couldn't afford to let the stress break him. He had a bigger mission now. This wasn't just about getting justice for Big Thunder. It was about taking down the tyrant who had held the community hostage for far too long. By the time the day of the hearing arrived, Eddie and Jia were ready. The community was behind them, the evidence was stacked in their favor, and the legal strategy was sound. Eddie knew that winning wasn't going to be easy. He had seen enough of Karen's manipulative tactics to know she wouldn't give up without a fight. But Eddie was prepared to fight back with everything he had. This wasn't just his battle, it was the community's. And he wasn't going to let Karen get away with it. The courtroom was packed. The tension was thick in the air, heavy with anticipation. Eddie sat at the plaintiff's table, his mind focused, but his heart pounding. Across from him, Karen Whitlock sat with her lawyer, both exuding an air of confidence that made Eddie's blood boil. He had to stay sharp. This was the moment of truth. All the preparation, all the evidence, everything led up to this. Jia, seated beside him, whispered a few final words of encouragement. "You've got this. Just stick to the facts, and let the law do the talking." Her voice was calm, but Eddie could hear the underlying fire in it. She was ready to win this. And so was he. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The formalities were brief, and then the case was called. The first move went to Karen's side, as expected. Her lawyer stood up and began his opening statement with a grandiose tone, attempting to paint Eddie as a reckless rancher who had allowed his prized bull to run wild, causing destruction on the pristine property that Karen had carefully cultivated. He spoke about the importance of maintaining order and following HOA regulations, making it sound as though Karen was just a victim of Eddie's negligence. Eddie clenched his fists under the table, the urge to interrupt rising, but Jia squeezed his hand, a silent reminder to stay composed. When it was Eddie's turn, he stood up and addressed the court with calm confidence. Big Thunder wasn't some uncontrolled beast. He was a well-trained animal who had never posed a threat. This isn't about property damage. This is about an abuse of power. Karen Whitlock killed my bull because she could. His words cut through the room, and he could feel the eyes of the courtroom shift, the weight of the truth settling in. Eddie carefully outlined the events, sticking to the facts. He explained how Big Thunder had accidentally broken through the fence and wandered into Karen's garden. He described the bull's gentle nature and how, despite the damage to Karen's garden, Big Thunder had not been violent. Then, he pointed out the glaring fact that Karen had no legal right to shoot Big Thunder. The clause she cited in the HOA rules was meant for genetically engineered biobeasts, not livestock like Big Thunder. It was a misapplication of the law, plain and simple. Eddie's voice didn't falter as he laid out the specifics, pointing to the statute that had been misused, highlighting the clear distinction between the two categories. Jia followed up, presenting the evidence they had painstakingly gathered. She introduced witness statements from several residents who had witnessed Karen's history of misusing her position as HOA president to harass others. She made it clear that Karen wasn't just a concerned homeowner. She was a power-hungry individual who had used the HOA to control the lives of others. Jia's argument was laser-focused, hammering home the point that Karen had overstepped her boundaries in every way, and the death of Big Thunder was just the most egregious example. Karen's lawyer stood up to object, but Eddie could see the cracks forming in their defense. They had no real legal argument to stand on. They tried to shift the focus back to the supposed danger of Big Thunder, but every time they attempted to spin the story, Eddie and Jia had a counterpoint ready. The evidence was airtight. Karen had used the HOA's rules to justify an illegal act. The more Eddie spoke, the more it became clear that Karen wasn't the victim. She was the aggressor. As the trial progressed, Eddie could feel the momentum shift in his favor. The witnesses they called testified about Karen's history of bullying, the constant fines she'd imposed for trivial reasons, and the way she manipulated the rules to get what she wanted. One by one, the residents who had once feared Karen now stood up in court, their voices steady as they described how she had treated them. The dam of fear had finally broken, and now it was Karen who was on trial, not just for killing Big Thunder, but for her ongoing abuse of the community. Karen's lawyer attempted to undermine the testimonies, accusing the witnesses of bias, but the damage had been done. The more they pushed, the more the truth was revealed. Karen wasn't just a concerned HOA president, she was a tyrant, a woman who had used her position to make everyone's life miserable. And now, she had taken it too far. Finally, the time came for closing arguments. Eddie stood once again, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't need to rehash every detail. The evidence had already spoken for itself. Instead, he focused on the bigger picture. "This case isn't just about a bull," he said, his voice strong and clear. "It's about what happens when someone with power decides they are above the law. It's about standing up to that person, no matter how big or small, and saying enough. Karen Whitlock may think she can hide behind the rules, but the law is clear. And the law is on our side." Jia's closing statement echoed his sentiment, calling out Karen for her abuse of power, for taking a life with no justification. She reminded the court that this wasn't about one incident. It was about holding someone accountable for a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. When the judge finally spoke, Eddie's heart skipped a beat. The room was silent as the judge reviewed the facts, carefully weighing the evidence presented. Eddie didn't know what to expect, but his gut told him they had done everything right. The judge paused for a moment longer than usual, then lipped up. "The defendant, Karen Whitlock, is hereby found guilty of unlawfully taking the life of a legally protected animal and misapplying HOA regulations to justify her actions. The court orders restitution to the plaintiff, Eddie Torres, for the wrongful death of his livestock, and further sanctions against the defendant for her abuse of power within the HOA." The room erupted into murmurs. Eddie felt his entire body relax in the moment that the judge's words sank in. Karen's face went pale, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. It was over. The court had sided with him, with the truth. Eddie had won, but more than that, the community had won. The system that had allowed someone like Karen to flourish was finally being held accountable. As the gavel came down, Eddie turned to Jia. He could see the pride in her eyes, the satisfaction of a battle well fought. But there was more to be done. This was just the beginning. The court's decision was a victory, but it wasn't the end. Eddie felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was quickly replaced by a rush of adrenaline. Karen Whitlock had been taken down, but there was more work to do. The community, for the first time in years, had a chance to breathe. They had stood up against a tyrant, and they had won. Now it was time to rebuild what Karen had tried so hard to tear down. The news spread quickly across Eden 5. The residents who had once lived in fear now saw the first signs of change. Eddie's phone rang off the hook with calls of congratulations and gratitude. People he barely knew reached out, some with offers of help, others simply expressing their relief. It felt good to know the community was finally free of Karen's reign of terror. But there was something else he needed to do, something that went beyond legal victories and public recognition. He had a responsibility now, not just to himself, but to everyone who had been affected by Karen's manipulation. Eddie turned to Jia, who had been by his side through the entire ordeal. Together, they met with the other residents to discuss what could be done to ensure that this never happened again. The first step, Eddie decided, was to establish a sanctuary. He had already been talking to the local government about converting part of his ranch into a place where animals, livestock, like Big Thunder, and others, could be safe from the whims of people like Karen. He wanted a space where every creature, no matter its size or purpose, could live without fear of arbitrary rules and unjust killings. It was his way of honoring Big Thunder's memory, of turning a personal loss into something bigger. He knew it wouldn't bring his bull back, but it would ensure that other animals wouldn't suffer the same fate. Eddie's vision began to take shape quickly. With the legal settlement from the court case, he had the funds to make the sanctuary a reality. He didn't just want to provide a safe place for animals, but he wanted to create a community space, one where people could come together, away from the overbearing authority of the HOA. Eddie envisioned a place where farmers, ranchers, and anyone with a love for the land could gather, share stories, and build something meaningful without fearing an arbitrary fine or the wrath of a power-hungry HOA president. The support from the community was overwhelming. People started to volunteer, offering to help with everything from building fences to landscaping the land. There was a renewed sense of camaraderie, a feeling that something real and lasting was being built. Eddie couldn't help but smile as he watched the transformation unfold before his eyes. It was a stark contrast to the bleak atmosphere Karen had left behind. No longer were people afraid to speak up. No longer were they shackled by the fear of a single individual who believed they could control every aspect of their lives. Now, they were taking control of their future. With the sanctuary taking shape, Eddie turned his attention to the final task, Karen's removal from the HOA. The legal ruling had been clear. Her actions had not only been illegal, but they had also violated the trust that the community had placed in her. It wasn't enough for Karen to face a fine or a civil lawsuit. She needed to be removed from the position that had allowed her to wield so much power. The next HOA meeting was scheduled to take place in a few weeks, and Eddie knew it was the perfect opportunity to push for her removal. Armed with the court ruling, the support of the community, and the clear evidence of her abuses, Eddie and Jia presented their case. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Karen was there, sitting at the front with her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed in defiance. She was no longer the all-powerful figure she once was. The community had seen her for what she truly was, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. When the vote was called, the result was decisive. Karen was removed from her position as HOA president, and the powers she had once used to manipulate and control others were stripped from her. There were no protests, no objections, only the sound of community members applauding the decision. The tyranny had ended, and Eden 5 could finally breathe again. In the days that followed, Eddie and Jia continued their work on the sanctuary. It wasn't just about the animals, it was about rebuilding trust. It was about showing the community that they didn't need to live in fear of arbitrary rules or a tyrant's whims. The sanctuary became a symbol of that new beginning. It was a place where people came together to make a difference, where they could put aside their differences and focus on what truly mattered, the land, the animals, and the community they had all fought for. Eddie stood at the entrance to the sanctuary, watching as volunteers worked tirelessly, the sound of hammers and saws filling the air. It was a far cry from the days when Karen had ruled with an iron fist. The place was alive with activity, a reflection of the hope and optimism that had taken root in the wake of the court ruling. Eddie could hardly believe how much had changed in such a short time. The weight of Karen's oppression had been lifted, and in its place, a new sense of community had emerged. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the sanctuary, Eddie reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He had lost Big Thunder, but in doing so, he had gained something far more important, a renewed sense of purpose. He had fought for justice, and he had won. The victory wasn't just his, it belonged to everyone who had stood with him, everyone who had been impacted by Karen's cruelty. The Big Thunder Memorial Park had become more than just a tribute to one animal. It had become a testament to the power of community, to the strength of standing up for what was right, no matter the odds. Eddie knew there would always be challenges ahead, but for the first time in years, he felt confident that no matter what came their way, the people of Eden 5 would face it together. And that, he thought as he looked out over the land, was the true victory.